This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. So in the last podcast, I was talking about the coercive laws of competition and how they work and how those laws get refracted through oligopolistic practices. But we geographers, and I'm now going to talk as a geographer, know that there's another form of competition, which is terribly important, which is what we call monopolistic competition. Now, it sounds weird, right, this term monopolistic competition, but it comes about for following reason. That if I occupy a particular piece of land, I have power over it. I have a monopoly power over that piece of land. My neighbor has monopoly power over his or her piece of land. We put those two pieces of land in competition with each other, and you're really putting two monopolistic in relationship to each other. Now, monopolistic competition becomes terribly important because if I have a piece of land near the center of the city, I can withhold the use of that land and I can command an immense amount of money for it. I can, in fact, command a monopoly rent. So all spatial competition is monopolistic competition. And this monopolistic competition depends crucially upon transport and communications, and also upon the absolute command over land, which is given by private property rights in land and by the land market. So this has a very interesting history. We would think that there will be a lot of competition when capital was essentially small individual producers all over the place. And we would look at it and say, well, there's a great, nobody's monopolizing the market. There is no big power. Therefore, there's a competitive world because capital is organized. It's largely small scale, but the small scale industry in the 19th century was often organized on a monopolistic basis. For example, every village in France would have a bakery. Bakers were not in competition with each other. It wasn't as if somebody living in village A would go over 15 miles to another village to get their daily bread. But there will be one baker in town, okay? And this happened in brewing too, so that there will be one brewer in a particular town. And it would not be in competition with others. In other words, when transport costs were high, individual capitalists were protected against competition. The village baker had almost no competition in France in the 19th century. They were monopolists. They could charge what they liked, and they could, do as they liked. And if it was good quality or bad quality, people needed bread, and they would go to the baker and get their bread. They would go there and go to a local place and get their beer. And so there was a lot of industries that were protected by high transport costs. Now, what this does is to say that competition exists over the monopoly qualities and also over the location and relative location of particular activities relative to all competing activities. So there are many industries that were actually founded in this kind of way. In the early part of the 19th century, in the United States, for example, a lot of iron was being produced in small local furnaces in local areas. And today you go around in New England and places like that, and somebody will say, "Look, there's some old forges over there." And they were not in competition with, say, British products. They were producing for iron products for the local community. So the small scale of firm organization when it was coupled with very high transport costs, meant that there were lots of little monopolies, powers all over the place, and that there was a high level of monopoly given by high transport costs. This was exacerbated by the fact that in many instances there were also high tariffs to movements, particularly of the nations, but in many localities there were tithes and other kind of and tolls and things like that were levied. So there were many social barriers to movement, which produced these sort of monopoly areas. And I've already mentioned last week in a podcast the way in which the world was carved up under the Bretton Woods Agreement into states, and those states had autonomy in relationship to their fiscal and monetary policy, and that to some degree industries within those states were protected by the border so that they could be, if you like, monopolistically powered within the state apparatus. And this was true in Latin America and under import substitution policies. This was true for throughout the world through Bretton Woods. But the collapse of the Bretton Woods wiped all those barriers away. That leaves lots of tariffs. Now, the United States, being the hegemonic power in 1945, started to introduce the idea of reduction of all political and economic barriers to trade through the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, the GATT agreement, which ultimately led, of course, to the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which effectively had the world sort of pretty open to free flow of capital pretty much everywhere. So that competition, things became much more competitive as space relations were transformed, both by innovations in transport and communications, and also by the reduction in tariff and other barriers. Now, this is peculiar because in one way you started to see an increasing competitiveness in the global economy through globalization and all the rest of it, and the reduction of transport costs, particularly through the introduction of containerization in the 1960s, so that by the 1970s, the transport costs have become a very small part of the cost of a commodity. And therefore, transport costs have gone to the point where they're not exactly zero, but they're not playing the role of protecting people in one place from competition on the other side of the world. We're getting competition across the world for products and also for new systems of production. So this is one aspect of it. Competition is increasing. As competition increases and it becomes more competitive on a global scale, so you start to find capitalists themselves getting very, very, very concerned to protect themselves against competition by increasing centralization of capital, by mergers and acquisitions and so on, to make mass corporations which are so massive that they can actually dictate conditions of trade and dictate prices. So, but also doing something else, which I think is really very, very significant. And that something else is to engage in product differentiation. Now, when Marx was writing, consumer durables were negligible as an area of commerce. When Marx was writing, the idea that there may be some consumer choice on the part of the mass of the population and even of the working class was not very well set out. But what product differentiation did was to start to try and create monopolies by moving much more from the price and the mass thing to qualities, reputation, and intangibles. So suddenly those questions start to move into the forefront. And this is what you see on the television all of the time in terms of advertising. It's about qualities and reputation and intangibles. And so you get this idea that in fact, the homogeneity that is presupposed in the theory of capital accumulation that Marx lays out is being displaced by a heterogeneity. Now, it can't be a complete heterogeneity, but it starts to erode, if you like, the simplicity of the idea of coercive laws of competition, because you're dealing with heterogeneous kinds of products. You take something like shampoos, for example, and you go into the store and you see, dozens and dozens of different brands of shampoo, and some of them are high priced. And they play the trick of suggesting to you that if they're high priced, it must be because they're better. And people pay the higher price because they think it's better, even though it turns out, in fact, if anybody cared to do it, that it may well be inferior to something that is much, much cheaper, but has not sort of blazoned this idea that how important it is. So this idea, what happens in consumer markets starts to become very, very, very confused, and the relationship between price and value goes all over the place, and that then means that many of the consumer goods are supposedly separated from and separable from all other consumer goods because they are unique. Now, this idea of uniqueness it starts to become part and parcel of how the coercive laws of competition are working. Because the coercive laws of competition have to deal with the fact that the claims by producers are that each product that they make is unique and it is special, and therefore it is not in competition. In other words, there's an evasion of competition like crazy. And that evasion of competition takes this thing of product differentiation, the uniqueness and of the commodity as being very highly significant, which leads to some very, very strange kind of effects. Now, Marx was aware that something like this could occur, and argued that, look, monopolies can actually generate what he called monopoly rent. Now, monopoly rent means that on my piece of land, I can produce something which is of such perfect quality that it's only on that piece of land that this thing can be produced, and therefore I can charge a monopoly rent for the land, and I get a monopoly price for the product. The classic case of this is, of course, in the wine trade, and the wine trade is fascinating for this particular reason. Which is that the claim is that a particular vintage of wine from a particular place is unique, and that therefore it can be uniquely priced. And the way it is unique is that it's produced on a particular piece of land, and which has particular kind of qualities, and those qualities are such that it produces a quality of wine which is so special that you're willing to pay $100 a bottle for it, or $200 a bottle for it, or something like that. And so this monopoly pricing, and this monopoly pricing gets institutionalized, so that you have in France you have a system of appellation contrôlée, which is that only a certain amount of wine can be produced in a certain region. That can be called Beaujolais or Morgon or whatever the particular brand is, and that is allowed a monopoly price because there is control on the total quantity of wine that can be produced. And of course, then this goes by vintage, so that 2018 is different from 2016 and all the rest of it. So the wine trade is full of assertions about monopoly control. And in fact, what we get is this fascinating attempt by, in part, producing a product, the wine, which has definite qualities and which people will come along and taste, and some will decide they like it and some will decide they won't, and it'll get a reputation and all the rest of it. But then there comes the idea of expert opinion coming in to tell you what are the good wines. So that you'll go into a wine store and you'll see, this is 99 points and this is 25 points and this is, they never put 25, but this is 99 points and this is 85 points and all kinds of things of that kind. So they're trying to play this game of monopoly pricing. And the monopoly pricing is partly about the actual nature of the product, but it's also about the discourse about the product. So you go to a wine catalogue and you see all of these kinds of experts saying this wine or that wine. You find in the newspapers, there'll be, what are the best wines this year? What are the good vintages? What are not? And so on. So this is playing a game with the product in which monopoly pricing, monopoly rent, monopoly due to particular circumstances of production become significant. Now this has also grown significantly over the last 40 or 50 years. When I came to the United States, I would go, most wine stores carried jug wine from California and maybe a couple of imported wines. I mean, it was very difficult to find a good wine store in a major city, and the wine stores were few and far between. Now we get wine stores all over the place, and they're all sort of advertising certain kinds of wines, which are again, it's this monopolistic quality that you've got to get your Pinot Noir from Willamette Valley, or you've got to get your Malbec from Patagonia or something like that. So you get this kind of competition going on, which is a form of monopolistic competition. But the general thing about monopolistic competition is very interesting because it's about locational advantage. And locational advantage for a producer that produces close to a major market has an advantage over somebody who is producing a long distance away from the market. And therefore, there is competition for market access. If I have my piece of land and there's nothing going on around it, it's not very valuable. If I can persuade the state to build a highway close by and have a highway intersection close by, suddenly my piece of land becomes extremely valuable because its relative location has changed. It was inaccessible. Now it's accessible because assets have been built, and developers will go in and try to get people to set up the sewers and the road networks and all that kind of thing, which will allow them to develop easily in a particular place. So all locational analysis is about monopolistic competition. And the theory of monopolistic competition has some very interesting qualities to it, and I'll give you one of them, which is in effect quite funny. But back in the 1920s, a man called Hennelly started to look at monopolistic competition in terms of location, and he used the example of where would two ice cream sellers on a beach locate themselves. From the social point of view, you would think that they should locate themselves about 1/4 way in from one side and the other 1/4 way in from the other side, so that they actually divided the market into two, and people would have access to the ice cream seller at a reasonable thing. So you would expect a long beach, and you would expect two ice cream sellers to be 1/4 way in, and then 1/4 way and half a way will be between them. So you could imagine that, and you would say that is an optimal thing from the standpoint of consumers, because that minimizes the travel time of consumers to get the ice cream, because everybody is close enough to the one where they're located. But then Hennelly points out and says, well, let's suppose the ice cream sellers are mobile, and one ice cream seller moves the barrow a bit closer to the center. And so in doing, actually, in terms of distances, starts to steal some of the consumption capacity from the other ice cream seller. Well, the other ice cream seller will compensate by moving a little bit closer back into right, and matter of fact, maybe moving a little bit further to steal a bit from the other. And this process will go on, says Hennelly, until you end up with two ice cream sellers on the beach, both of them located next to each other, right in the center. This is a very interesting thing, because I've often gone to beaches now, and I always look where the ice cream sellers are located, and they're always located in the center. Because this is the nature of monopolistic competition, that you are competing for the market and by moving to the center. But this is not optimal from the standpoint of the consumers. In other words, the social optimum, which would have you spread out on the beach, is violated by the competitive optimum, which means the two of them together. So two ice cream sellers on the beach, there you have it. Then Hennelly did something very interesting, and he said, well, what happens if the third ice cream seller gets onto the beach? Well, then the whole thing gets unstable. That is, the third ice cream seller moves in, and one ice cream seller has to move out to compensate that, and they will do that until one will hop over and go to the other. In other words, with three ice cream sellers, and you can play this game if you like, you end up, it's totally unstable. Now, this is actually high economics, because if you have instability, it means you have no equilibrium. And therefore, there's no equilibrium locations which can be derived, and that means there's no equilibrium prices. And that, that drives economists crazy. And this led two economists, Koopmans and Beekman, to lay out a theoretical analysis of how a locational theory might work in terms of stabilizing and analyzing where people would locate, given that the competition is monopoly, it was spatial monopoly competition. And the answer they came to was that there is no equilibrium. And this is, like I said, this is something which is anathema to economists, because everything is supposed to have theoretically an equilibrium. But here was a situation where theoretically there was no equilibrium that could be established. And this was so shocking to these economists that they didn't publish this result for several years, on the grounds that this would upset so many economists, because the whole basis of economics would be when it became spatialized, and you're dealing with spatial monopoly and monopolistic competition, then there's no equilibrium. And since all competition at some point is spatial competition and monopolistic competition, then what you get is a landscape which is constantly in motion. Now, this is one of the things you see from the two ice cream sellers example, is that there tends to be a push towards agglomeration. That is, the two, in this case, the two sellers get together and make a kind of basic. Now, in cities, what you'll find is that this is frequently the case. All of the jewelry stores in New York City, well, not all of them, but a big number of them are on 59th Street. It's, there's you would think that stores would spread out across the city. But if you want to buy, say lights or something like that in New York City, you go to a certain area of town because there are lots of light stores. Another one is a jewelry area. And so you're going to get concentrations coming out, because that's the way competition works. Competition produces these results, which are not necessarily optimal from the standpoint of the total organization of the system, which means that individual capitalists in competition with each other produce results all over the place which are not socially optimal, even from the standpoint of capital accumulation. So Hennelly's argument was a very interesting one, because it suggested that to the degree that there is no such thing as competition that doesn't have a monopolistic element incorporated in it, particularly if the competition is spatial competition, which is by definition monopolistic competition, then what you get is unstable kinds of landscapes emerging, except for the tendency to there to be agglomeration economies. Now, here this is fascinating, because Marx pointed out in Capital that when there are many competitors around, the tendency is for many of the producers to agglomerate in the same area, because that's where the transport and communication sectors focus, And because of the producers agglomerating there, so more activities develop there. In other words, there is a natural tendency within competitive capitalism for rich regions to get richer and poor regions to be poorer. That increasingly capital moves from the poorer regions into the major metropolises. And this is a result, again, of spatial competition, monopolistic competition. And again, what that says is that actually there's a huge incentive for spatial competition, monopolistic competition, to produce large metropolitan concentrations where a lot of the activity is organized versus large empty areas. Now, you look at the United States right now, and you've got about 10 or 12 agglomerations that produce about 70 or 80% of the GDP of the country. And the rest of the country is not doing much at all in terms of production of GDP. And guess who votes for whom in that picture? In other words, concentration and centralization doesn't only occur in firms, it also occurs in metropolitan regions because of this monopolistic competition. Firms themselves engage in monopolistic competition. And that is the point of sort of saying, well, if a pharmaceutical company is doing very well because it has a kind of has a monopoly power over certain of the drugs that it's developed, something like the virus comes along and immediately some of those companies have to have the research capacity to be able to respond to that and capture it. So Pfizer captures it, Moderna captures it, Johnson & Johnson tried to capture it. So those firms, even though they are monopolies and have a lot of monopolistic power over pricing and monopolistic power over innovation and so on, they are at the same time having to organize themselves so that they constantly respond to the needs of society and capitalize on those needs and make huge profits from them, as Pfizer has obviously done in the recent pandemic. And those processes of increasing concentration of wealth and power and production capacity and innovation capacity within corporations are matched by increasing concentrations of all of those elements in major metropolitan areas. So the theory of monopolistic competition says you're not dealing with the coercive landscape that Marx dealt with or theorized, and Ricardo theorized and Adam Smith theorized, where there's a lot of individuals who are operating in a competitive space. We're dealing always with monopolistic competition, and the monopolistic competition has become more and more important, so that there is, I think, a case to be made that a lot of the theory of the falling rate of profit has to be modified by the idea that there is monopolistic competition at work rather than simply competition. And that even though this term, the coercive laws of competition, falls off the lips very easily, we have to say what kind of competition is it, over what sorts of things is it competition. Are these forms of competition significant in terms of metropolitanization? So, and this is something which again is being worked out in Keynesian terms by Gunnar Myrdal, and this is a very, very interesting book about the underdevelopment, the production of underdevelopment, and in which Myrdal kind of said, look, there is a process at work through competition, and that's the point, through competition, which means that rich regions grow richer and poor regions grow poorer. And that process is driven by what he calls the circular and cumulative laws of capital accumulation. So Myrdal was not a Marxist, but he was actually, I think, matching Marx by talking about the increasing concentration and centralization of capital. Marx talked about a book on competition. He also talked about the laws of increasing centralization of capital and promised a book about the increasing centralization of capital. I think these are things that we need to take up and think about because they're terribly important in terms of understanding how the economy works. And just one minor point at the end of this is how Hennelly actually is used in political science. Because in political science, the argument would be, well, Where do political parties position themselves in terms of an electorate? Do you stay out on the far left? Do you stay out on the far right? Where do you stay? No. If you move a bit towards the center, you steal some of the voting power of your rival. So they move a bit closer to the center. So in a two-party system, you'll end up with both parties right dead in the center. Very little differentiation going on between them, which has been the case in the United States for many, many years. The result is that you get two wings of the party of Wall Street, as I like to call it. The one's called Democrat and the other's a Republican. That has shifted a little bit because clearly Trump has taken it out a little bit taken out from the center. So what happens now? Well, you would have thought Democrats could move into that territory, but there seems to be some problem. But then the issue is, what happens if a third party comes in? Well, then the answer is unstable. And so you get a fourth and a fifth party, and it gets very unstable. And you get the kind of politics you see in Italy and the long history of coalitions and different parties and alliances, and the same thing going on in France. So a two-party system will end up with both parties close to the center. For the most part, at a historical moment, one party may move further to the left or further to the right, whatever. But if in a two-party system, what will happen socially, which is not for the benefit of society, what will happen politically and socially is that both parties will colonize the center. And this is like the two ice cream sellers on the beach, but you put in the third and the fourth and the fifth, then it gets unstable. And so you get these unstable political alliances emerging in countries like Italy and more recently in Germany and so on, where the politics operates in another way. So Hotelling's little parable about two ice cream sellers on a beach carries a lot of weight and a lot of significance, not only in terms of locational analysis, but also in terms of understanding political processes and voting habits. Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production. A special thank you to the wonderful Patreon community for supporting this project.